Good afternoon and welcome. We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez and I'm the Director of Government Affairs here at the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC. And thank you for joining us today, and thank the building for having such lovely air conditioning. So thank you, building. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices both in San Francisco and Sacramento. And for today's presentation, we're going to hear from PPIC researcher Alyssa Dykman, who will be presenting the findings from PPIC's latest survey on Californians and their environment. We'd like to thank the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, the Dirk and Charlene Capsonell Foundation, the Flora Family Foundation Fund, and the Heisig Simon Foundation for their support of this particular survey. We'd also like to thank the PPIC Donor Circle and the Corporate Circle for helping us make this event possible, including the lunch that was provided today. At registration, you should have received two handouts. One is a newly released fact sheet on Californians' view on coastal concerns, and the other handout contains some key findings from the survey. The full report, along with the slides from today's presentation, are now available at ppic.org. You'll also find the survey interactive tools featured on our website where you can create your own crosstabs and follow trends over time. After Alyssa's presentation, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers, but we do record these, so wait for a microphone to come to you. A few things before we begin. On Thursday, August 16th, PPIC will host a lunchtime event featuring Congressman Kevin McCarthy in conversation with PPIC President and CEO Mark Baldassari. This event is being held at the Sacramento Sheraton, and we encourage you to register soon. We are reaching capacity. Also, later today, you'll receive a short survey via email, and we ask that you please take some time and answer those questions. And please silence your cell phones. This survey is one of our 3 topic-specific surveys. We do 8 surveys a year on Californians and their government. And this one is one of 3 that we do. It's very specific. It is done every July. And of course, it's an election year, and we have some important information on the governor's race and U.S. Senate races. However, the core of this survey is about Californians and their views on the environment. Now, this timing of this survey feels right to me. I mean, it is over 100 in Sacramento, so talking about the environment in Sacramento is always fun at this time of year. We often talk about weather, and whether it's global warming or not, just living in Sacramento over 100 is something we like to talk about. But seriously, today we did actually correspond our coastal conversation with Shark Week, but I don't know if that was a coincidence or not, but thank you for doing that. But more seriously, I did actually wake up this morning to news on NPR about a fire tornado in Redding. And I made a really big choice about living in California, the Midwest. The idea that we have a tornado would be troubling, but a fire tornado is scary. But this is actually happening in Redding today. And it really does explain why more than 6 in 10 Californians are concerned about severe wildfires. It's also interesting to note that in our survey, there's some bipartisan agreement, and that's particularly around water. There is an agreement that water supply and drought is the most important issue to California. And again, that's something Californians and Sacramento folks talk about a lot. I also want to recommend to you that we also have some crosstabs on the survey that are really important. You can create your own crosstabs with our new system, or with our system, but we also have crosstabs for all voters, likely voters, and for all California, all residents that take the survey. And it's a great way to understand the variation of viewpoints in different regions of the state, and demographic changes of people about age and gender, race. It really is one of my favorite tools and how I got to know PPIC when I was a staffer in the legislature. I don't have a lot else to say about this because I don't want to take Alyssa's thunder. It is her first survey presentation, so be kind to her. But I'd like to now invite Alyssa Dykman up to do her presentation. Thank you.
So thank you, Deborah, and thank you all for being here today. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the other co-authors of this survey. That includes PPIC President, CEO, and Survey Director, Mark Baldassari, Associate Survey Director, Dean Bonner, and Research Associate, Luna Lopez. So before we get going, I want to preview what we will be looking at today. So first, I will go through a bit about PPIC statewide surveys and our methodology, and then go into two broad sections of the report. This first section includes the 2018 election and environmental issues, which includes the gubernatorial and U.S. Senate races, water, air pollution, and coastal issues, followed by a section on public's perceptions and policy preferences. This will be focused on approval ratings of state and federal elected officials, as well as climate change and energy policy. This will then be followed by some concluding remarks, and we will have time for questions at the end. So first, an introduction to PPIC statewide surveys. The mission of the survey is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions. We hope to inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, encourage discussion, and provide a voice for all Californians in important state policy debates. So since 1998, we have conducted over 170 general surveys, issue-specific, such as the environment today, and regional surveys. And during that time, we've interviewed over 350,000 Californians. So subsequently, we have a large database on questions and responses, and a large part of what we do is look at past questions and make comparisons to what we're seeing today. So this survey in particular is part of our Californians in the Environment series, which will now be in our 18th year of doing so. So we pretty much do this every July since 2000. I'd once again like to thank the funders for this survey, the David and Lucille Packer Foundation, the Dirk and Charlene Capsnell Foundation, the Flora Family Foundation, and the Heising Simons Foundation. So a bit about details about how we conducted the survey. The survey was fielded from July 8th through 17th. All of our interviews were conducted via live telephone interviews, and these were conducted in either Spanish or English, depending on the preference of the respondent. So 70% of our interviews are conducted via cell phone, and 30% are conducted via landline. We spoke to 1,711 adults, of which we identified 1,020 likely voters. The margin of error for the adult sample was 3.4 percentage points, and likely voters 4.3 percentage points. So once again, we emphasize preferences in the gubernatorial and U.S. Senate races, water, air pollution and coastal issues, and then approval ratings, climate change, and energy policy. So let's get into it. So to start with the 2018 election and environmental issues, we'll look at the role of the environment in the upcoming gubernatorial and U.S. Senate elections. And I think it's important to provide some context. So coming off the June primary, California saw the highest reported turnout rate in a midterm primary election since 1998. And today we find that 6 in 10 likely voters are following news about the candidates very or fairly closely. So when it comes to the race for governor, Democrat Gavin Newsom leads Republican John Cox among likely voters, 55 to 31%. So Newsom maintains a 24-point lead over Cox. 1 in 10 likely voters are undecided at this time, and Newsom and Cox receive support from at least 8 in 10 of their respective parties, and Newsom leads Cox among independents by 8 points. Regionally, Newsom has majority support in Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area, whereas Cox leads in the Inland Empire. Among racial and ethnic groups, a solid majority of Latino likely voters and about half of white likely voters prefer Newsom over Cox. And just a note about our racial and ethnic groups, we do not report findings on Asian American and African American likely voters, as these subgroups are too small for separate analyses. So when asked about how important the candidates' positions are on the environment in determining their vote, nearly all of likely voters say that these positions are important. The share of likely voters saying the candidates' positions are very important is the highest it has been since PPIC began asking this question among likely voters in 2016, and this represents a 16-point increase since 2014. Today, when looking across parties, Democrats are much more likely than independents and Republicans to say the candidates' positions are very important. And of those supporting Newsom for governor, 70% say the candidates' positions on the environment are very important, whereas 25% of Cox supporters say the same. There is also another election in November, the U.S. Senate race. And today, incumbent Dianne Feinstein leads California state senator and fellow Democrat Kevin de León by nearly a 2-to-1 margin, so 46 to 24%. This is a similar margin to what we found in May leading up to the primary. Today, among Democrats, Feinstein has the support of 2 in 3 likely voters and leads de León among independents. Notably, given the nature of the top 2 primary system, we have a November election featuring 2 Democrats on the ballot. And with no Republicans to choose from, 47% of Republican likely voters volunteer they would not vote in this race, and 24% of independent likely voters also say the same. Feinstein leads de León by 20 points across education and racial and ethnic groups, women, those ages 55 and older, and those in Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. When we exclude those who volunteer they would not vote, Feinstein has a 28-point lead over de León. And transitioning to how candidates for statewide office should interact with the federal government, when asked which of the following is more important to you in candidates for statewide office, such as governor or U.S. senator, when it comes to environmental issues, that they work with or push back against the Trump administration, a majority of likely voters prefer candidates to push back, while 4 in 10 prefer to work with the administration. As you might expect, partisan likely voters are on opposite sides, with more than 8 in 10 Democrats saying push back and 8 in 10 Republicans say candidates should work with the Trump administration. Half of independents prefer to push back. Notably, women and Latinos are more likely than men and women and whites to prefer state leaders to push back against the Trump administration. And of those who say candidates should push back, 62% would vote for Dianne Feinstein and 25% would vote for Kevin de León. Among likely voters who say that they should work with the Trump administration, 42% say they would not vote in the US Senate race. And when Californians go to the polls in November, they'll be asked to make several choices at the ballot. And this includes 12 propositions, ranging from topics such as homelessness, a repeal of the gas tax, and a water bond. Proposition 3 is an $8.9 billion water bond that will fund various water infrastructure projects throughout the state in areas such as water quality and water supply, watersheds, and fisheries improvements. This $8.9 billion bond will be the second water bond Californians will vote on this year, following the passage of Proposition 68 in June, which was a $4.1 billion bond measure that focused on things including parks, natural resources protection, climate adaptation, water and flood protection. Today, when asked about the $8.9 billion bond measure on the November ballot, 58% of likely voters would vote yes, while 25% would vote no. Democratic likely voters are far more likely than independents and Republicans to express support for this bond today, yet 4 in 10 Republicans say they would vote yes. Majorities across regions would vote yes, with support highest in the Orange County and San Diego counties. And support is much higher among Latino likely voters than whites and in those in other racial ethnic groups. So given the upcoming election and transitions at the state level, what do Californians think is the most important environmental issue facing the state today? When asked this open-ended question, likely voters are most frequently named water supply and drought as the most important environmental issue, followed by air pollution, global warming, and water pollution. Findings were similar among all adults as well. Since we last asked this question in 2016, likely voters naming water supply and drought has decreased sharply. In 2016, 43% of likely voters named it as the top issue. Notably, this was during the historic drought, so that is somewhat understanding. Nonetheless, water supply and drought still resonates with Californians today. Earlier this year, Governor Brown signed 2 new laws that will require cities and water districts across the state to set permanent water conservation rules, even in non-drought years. And today, when asked whether the supply of water is a big problem, somewhat of a problem, or not much of a problem in your part of California, nearly half of Californians and 6 in 10 likely voters say the supply of water is a big problem. The share of Californians saying water supply is a big problem is higher today than when we last asked this question this past March, as well as in last July. 2/3 across regions say the supply of water is at least somewhat of a problem, with residents in Orange and San Diego counties the most likely to say it is a big problem, whereas the residents in the San Francisco Bay Area are the least likely to say so. Majorities of parties majorities across parties say the supply of water is a big problem, and among racial and ethnic groups, whites are much more likely than African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans to say the supply of water is a big problem. With California naming air pollution as the second most important environmental issue facing the state today, when asked, would you say that air pollution is a big problem, somewhat of a problem, or not much of a problem in your part of the state, 2 in 3 Californians and likely voters say air pollution is a problem in their part of California, while a third say it is not a problem. There are wide differences across regions, with residents in Los Angeles and the Central Valley most likely to say that air pollution is a big problem. And notably, Latinos and African Americans are more likely than Asian Americans and whites to say it is a big problem. Now, getting at a more environmental justice related question with respect to air pollution, we asked, do you think that air pollution is a more serious threat in lower income areas than other areas in your part of California or not? Similar to last year, a majority of adults and likely voters say air pollution is a more serious threat in these areas, though adults saying yes is a high point in our surveys. The likelihood of saying air pollution is a greater health threat in lower income areas decreases as income rises. And across racial and ethnic groups, African Americans and Latinos are much more likely than Asian Americans and far more likely than whites to hold this view. Regionally, Los Angeles residents are the most likely to say air pollution is a more serious threat in lower income areas. So moving on, as Deborah mentioned, it is Shark Week this week, so very timely. And we asked several questions related to California's ocean and coastal areas. So we asked, how important is the condition of the ocean and beaches to the economy and quality of life for California's future? Similar to last year, we found that nearly all say the condition of the ocean and beaches is very important to the state. This includes more than 7 in 10 adults across political parties and more than 7 in 10 across age, income, and education groups. Regionally, more than 2 in 3 adults say these conditions are very important, while residents in Los Angeles are the most likely to express this view. Strong majorities of both coastal and inland residents say the condition is very important as well. Also asked, thinking about the overall health and quality of the ocean along the California coast today, would you rate them as excellent, good, fair, or poor? So while a strong majority of Californians view the state's ocean and beaches as very important to the state's economy, only 4 in 10 give a positive rating to the overall health and quality of the ocean along the state's coast. A majority of Californians say the overall health and quality along the state's coast is fair or poor. And at least half of residents across age, education, income, and racial ethnic groups rate the overall health quality as fair or poor. We also asked 2 questions pertaining to concerns about coastal issues, concern about ocean warming having impact on marine and coastal life, and concern over sea level rise having impact on flooding and erosion. On the issue of ocean warming, half of Californians are very concerned, an additional 28% are somewhat concerned. 22% are not or not at all concerned. Across parties, Democrats and independents are much more likely than Republicans to say they are very concerned. College graduates are also much more likely than those with only a high school education to say they are very concerned about this issue. When asked about rising sea levels, 45% of Californians say they're very concerned, and a quarter say they're not or not at all concerned. Coastal residents are much more likely than inland residents to say they are very concerned about this issue. And as with concerns about ocean warming, Democrats and independents are far more likely than Republicans to be very concerned. Now, in regards to ocean and coastal policies, we asked a question that we've been tracking for over a decade now, and that's whether Californians favor or oppose allowing more offshore oil drilling off the coast. This past January, the United States Department of Interior released plans to allow new offshore oil drilling in areas along the nation's coast, including California. And when asked about allowing more oil drilling off the California coast today, 67% of Californians are opposed and 27% are in favor. Findings were similar last July, and across parties, an overwhelming majority of Democrats and a strong majority of independents are opposed, while a slight majority of Republicans are in favor. Majorities across demographic groups are opposed, and regionally, fewer than a third of residents, with the exception of the Inland Empire, favor more oil drilling. Majorities of both coastal and inland residents are opposed. So moving on to our section on public perceptions and policy preferences, of which these questions are mostly related to the issue of climate change. So first, we'll take a look at approval ratings of state and federal elected officials, and then we can take a look at the role of the state in relation to its leadership in addressing climate change, public perceptions on climate change, specific climate change policies and their impacts, and then finally, cap and trade. So what we do with our environment surveys is that we ask about approval overall and approval of how the elected officials are handling environmental issues. Which you can see here, there are similarities between the overall approval and the approval of how they're handling environmental issues. But notably, you can tell there are some differences between approval ratings between the state and federal levels. Today, about half of Californians approve of the overall job performance of Governor Brown and 4 in 10 of the state legislature. These are similar to approval ratings we found in May and similar to a year ago. So that is pretty stable. Across parties, Democrats are far more likely than independents and Republicans to express approval for both the governor and the California legislature in their handling of environmental issues. Whereas looking at federal elected officials, approval remains far lower. About a quarter approve of President Trump in his handling of environmental issues, and 2 in 10 of Congress. For the President and U.S. Congress, approval is similar to what we found earlier this year and similar to last July. And during the period when we were fielding our survey, Gallup's weekly tracking number of presidential approval was at 43%. So we're at 43% nationwide and 29% in California. So a bit of a gap there, but not too surprising. And looking a bit more closely at approval ratings of state elected officials and their handling of environmental issues, today about, once again, half approve of the governor and 4 in 10 of the legislature. Both of these approval ratings have increased since 2011, reflecting a more than 10-point increase for both the governor and the legislature. These ratings are similar to last year, but reflect an overall upward trend of their handling of environmental issues. In 2011, about 1 in 3 adults had no opinion on their state officials handling environmental issues, whereas about half as many do so today. So there are fewer don't knows today. During this period, we had numerous natural disasters, including severe wildfires and a record drought, and some big actions on climate change. So as Jerry Brown nears the end of his term as governor, the public is acknowledging the great strides he has taken to address environmental issues across the state. When it comes to climate change and energy policy, it is evident that California's political leaders and the federal government are moving in different directions. We asked Californians whether they favor or oppose the state government making its own policies separate from the federal government to address the issue of global warming. Solid majorities of adults and likely voters favor having the state make its own policies. These findings are similar to what we found last year when we asked this question, and since 2005, more than half of Californians have favored the state government making its own policies, separate from the federal government. In September, Governor Brown will co-chair the Global Climate Action Summit in nearby San Francisco, which will convene international and national leaders to address actions for climate change. So when asked whether it is important that California acts as a world leader when it comes to address climate change, 3 in 4 Californians say it is important. There's a similar pattern for both questions across parties, in which majorities of Democrats and independents are in favor of the state making separate policies and say it is important that California acts as a leader, whereas less than 3 in 10 Republicans favor state action and say that it's very important that California acts as a leader. The last big issue we'll look at before getting into policy is the public's perceptions of global warming. So as you can see here, we have been tracking this question for over a decade, and this question is when the effects of global warming will begin to happen. The response categories range from they already happening to they will never happen, and there's some categories in between. Gallup also asked this question nationally, and looking at nationwide and the statewide results, we see that California has always been close or ahead of adults nationwide, saying the effects of global warming are happening now. Across parties, Democrats and independents are far more likely to say the effects are happening now, whereas a quarter of Republicans say the effects will never happen. When we ask about the threat of global warming to the economy and quality of life for California's future, majorities of adults and likely voters say it is a very serious threat. At least half of adults have said very serious since 2015, and today 8 in 10 adults are at least somewhat say at least somewhat serious of a threat. Latinos are the most likely to say this, while whites are the least likely. Democrats are 3 times as likely as Republicans to say global warming is a very serious threat. And looking more at the possible impacts of global warming in California, as you're probably aware, there are numerous wildfires currently raging throughout the state amid stifling temperatures that are taking a toll on the state's economy, environment, and people. For example, earlier this week, Yosemite National Park was forced to close during peak tourism season due to the Ferguson fire outside of the park's boundaries. And as fire season continues in California, it is likely the state will face even more fires in the coming months. So thinking about the possible impact of global warming in California, we asked, how concerned are you about more severe wildfires because of extreme weather? We found 6 in 10 are very concerned about more severe wildfires, including majorities across regions say they are very concerned. 8 in 10 across regions and demographic groups say they are at least somewhat concerned about this issue. Across parties, Democrats are far more likely than independents and Republicans to say they are very concerned, and coastal residents are similarly likely than inland residents to say they are very concerned about this issue. And many Californians are concerned about the impacts of global warming in the wake of a prolonged drought and facing fears of more severe wildfires due to extreme weather. So we thought it was important to ask, how important is the issue of global warming to you personally? This question was also asked nationally in a June ABC News, Stanford, and Resources for the Future poll. Today, 8 in 10 Californians say global warming is important to them personally, including 6 in 10 who say it is extremely or very important to them personally. Compared to adults nationwide, Californians are much more likely to say the issue is important to them. Majorities across regions and demographic groups also say the issue is of personal importance to them. So now to specific policies. So the California Air Resources Board recently announced the state has reduced greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels 2 years in advance of the 2020 goal set by AB 32, a goal that strong majorities of Californians supported in our surveys from 2006, when it was passed, to 2016. In 2016, policymakers passed SB 32, which set a new goal of further reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. When asked about this goal of SB 32, 2 in 3 Californians are in favor, including strong majorities of Democrats and independents, as well as 41% of Republicans. Support for SB 32 was similar last July, and across racial and ethnic groups, Latinos are the most likely to be in favor, followed by Asian Americans, African Americans, and whites. We also looked at another policy that the state is considering, SB 100, which would require that 100% of the state's electricity to be generated by renewable sources by 2045, including 50% by 2026. In 2015, the state legislature passed SB 350, which among other things established the goal that 50% of California's electricity come from renewable sources by 2030. Today, when asked about the 100% renewable goal, most Californians are in favor, including at least 7 in 10 Democrats and independents and nearly half of Republicans. 2 in 3 or more of Californians across regions and racial ethnic groups are in favor. And so recently, the United States Environmental Protection Agency announced that it would relax future fuel standards, and they're expected to announce as early as next week whether this involves a rollback of national fuel economy standards for vehicles, which in turn could possibly revoke California's ability to set its own higher standards, of which California currently has a waiver under the Clean Air Act to do so. When asked about setting higher emission standards for automobiles, 6 in 10 Californians are in favor. Democrats and independents are far more likely than Republicans to be in favor, and support is highest in the San Francisco Bay Area and lowest in the Inland Empire. Gallup also asked this question in March among adults nationwide, and we find that support was similar among Californians and adults nationwide. We also have a couple questions on the impacts of the state's climate policies, including whether California doing things to reduce global warming in the future would impact jobs, as well as impact gas prices at the pump. Today, about half of Californians say state action would lead to more jobs, and another 23% say it would not affect the number of jobs. 1 in 5 would say it would lead to fewer jobs. Since 2010, more jobs has always been the most common response, and today, across regions, racial and ethnic groups, age, education, and income groups, the most common response is also more jobs. Democrats are much more likely than independents and Republicans to say there would be more jobs. So while relatively few Californians expect state action on global warming to have a negative impact on jobs, majorities expect state action to cause gas prices to increase. This includes at least half across regions and parties, although Democrats are less likely than independents and Republicans to say that state action to reduce global warming would lead to an increase in gas prices at the pump. We also asked, in order to reduce global warming, would you be willing or not willing to pay more for electricity generated by renewable sources such as solar or wind energy? Today, half of Californians and likely voters say they're willing to pay more, which is similar to what we found last year. Yet there is a wide partisan divide, with 2 in 3 Democrats, half of independents, and 2 in 10 Republicans say they are willing. So now turning to a topic that majorities of Californians have heard a little or nothing about, cap and trade. Today, half of Californians and likely voters are in favor of the state's cap and trade system after hearing a brief description about it. Support has fluctuated from a high of 56% last July, which notably followed the passage of AB 398, which extended the state's cap and trade system until 2030, and ranged to a low of 49% in July of 2009, which is the first year we asked about the program. Majorities of Democrats and independents are in favor of the state's cap and trade system, compared to 3 in 10 Republicans. Finally, we ask in another environmental justice related question, which is, how important to you is it that some of the cap and trade revenues are spent on projects to improve environmental conditions in lower income and disadvantaged communities? Today, half of Californians say it is very important to spend some of the revenues this way, while an additional 3 in 10 say it is somewhat important. 1 in 5 say it is not important or not at all important. Those with lower incomes are the most likely to say it is very important, and African Americans and Latinos are much more likely than Asian Americans and far more likely than whites to hold this view. Again, Democrats are far more likely than independents and Republicans to say it is very important to spend revenues this way. So let me wrap up and then bring up some key points, and then we can open it up for questions. So in the race for governor, Democrat Gavin Newsom leads Republican John Cox with an 8 in 10 support from their respective parties. Incumbent Senator Dianne Feinstein leads fellow Democrat Kevin de León by a 22-point margin, with about half of Republicans and a quarter of independent likely voters volunteering they would not vote in this race. Most likely voters say gubernatorial candidates' positions on the environment are important when determining their vote, with a record high saying environmental positions are very important. With the drought and water shortages still on Californians' minds, adults and likely voters are most likely to name water supply and drought as the most important environmental issue facing the state today. Majorities of likely voters would vote yes in November on the $8.9 billion bond measure to fund various water infrastructure projects, even after passing a multi-billion-dollar bond this past June. Approval ratings of the president and Congress on their handling of their job in environmental positions are far lower than both the governor and legislature. On the issue of climate change, there are wide partisan differences on perceptions of this issue and actions the state could take to address the issue moving forward. And finally, many Californians say global warming is important to them personally, and majorities across regions, as well as racial ethnic groups, say they are very concerned about more severe wildfires because of extreme weather as an impact of global warming. So thank you, and now I'd like to open up for questions. Please wait for a mic as well. One of our friendly staffers will come around. Yes.
Did you have any kind of quantification of how much people would be willing to spend before they were disaffected from cap and trade?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we do not. We ask this just generally, their willingness to pay. We do not put a number on it. And this is due to just a tracking question. And we still feel like it's important that we get a general sense and gauge that Californians would be willing without putting a price on it. Or, yes.
I noticed that Chicano voters are consistently remarkably higher in their support of certain environmental measures. Do you have any insights as to how that happens?
I'm not sure personally the insights. However, we do find that Latinos and other racial and ethnic are more likely than other racial and ethnic groups, particularly whites, to say they're whether they're believing the perceptions of global warming are happening, as well as being in favor of state policies. But I can look more into that for you. That's a good point. Yes, Kelly.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I especially appreciate your including the environmental justice questions. And actually, in response to the last question, it's demonstrated that Latinos and blacks feel more of the impacts of pollution. So
Yes.
to me, it makes sense that they would be more concerned. And generally, you found a dramatic increase in the percentage of Californians that are prioritizing environmental issues. And I'm wondering if you have any information on why, or care to speculate. I could think of two likely reasons. One would be the Trump rollbacks of environmental protections, and another would be that we are increasingly seeing impacts on our own lives from climate change, like wildfires and heat waves.
Yeah, no, those are great points. Yeah, I agree that environmental issues are more of a transboundary issue that sort of sees no boundaries in certain senses, more than other issues that may affect people more regionally. However, going back to the environmental justice component, yes, I agree that whites are less likely than African Americans and Latinos to say and find that these perceptions of global warming are happening and whether they favor state action. I don't really want to speculate without providing the data to provide that, but I can look more into that.
It appears you were out in the field when the Democratic Party endorsed de León. Did he get a bump after that?
Yes, so he got the bump from the California Party. I think it was on that Saturday. We did not see a noticeable bump internally, but thank you for asking.
Hello, hi. Thank you for sharing your findings with us today. I was wondering if you've considered doing a poll to determine the effects on the approval ratings if we use the branding global warming versus climate change, because I recall, and maybe I'm wrong, that initially when this issue was brought up nationally, that it was always discussed as global warming, and then over time it's primarily advertised as climate change, which doesn't have the same emotional effect. So have you considered doing those sorts of studies and thinking about maybe is it time to rebrand this issue?
No, those are great points, and that's something we've definitely been recently discussing internally, and that's something we're definitely considering moving forward. I know there are different sentiments with these different connotations, whether a changing climate, global warming, climate change, and that's something we're definitely looking into. So thank you. Yes.
Given that these environmental surveys have been happening for almost 2 decades now, how do you know, or how are the results from these surveys being used? Are they used to galvanize support for different initiatives, or are they being used to kind of counteract the environmental work that's being done?
So a large part of the mission and goal of PPIC statewide surveys, as well as just PPIC as a greater organization, is to help inform the public as well as state policymakers on the data and information that we provide. So we like to see, hopefully some of our data is uptaked by policymakers, whether that's through legislative bill citations or amongst other things. Thank you. Any more? Yep.
Oh, right. I'm curious if in the data you see any specific, I guess, place-based data. So Butte County, thinking of Oroville Dam, or like North Bay fires, now Redding. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm a Redding native, so very, very happy that that was brought up. Ventura County. So I'm just curious if you see that in the data, whether folks are, if they experience this firsthand, if this resonates in your data files, and this would show up in your kind of the metadata that you have.
Yeah, great points. Well, I guess in regards to the more severe wildfires, we did find that more than 6 to 10 across all regions that we look at are very concerned about this issue. And we actually break down by region into 5 main regions, and that can be found on our crosstabs for each question, and that can be found online, so you can look more specifically into that.
I was wondering, Personally, for you, what was the most surprising or unexpected find from the data?
Yeah, I think just given the upcoming transitions at the state level and the upcoming gubernatorial race, I found it particularly striking. I can go back to that figure. I'm just saying the number of individuals saying that the candidates' positions on the environment are very important. I think this is just a notable increase and really demonstrate that the environmental issues are resonating with California voters today. Yes.
Back here.
Oh, yes.
Hi, I think you said that one of your points was that a large number of Republicans and independent voters would just not vote in the governor and senatorial race.
Yes.
Was that, how was the question framed? Was it, will you not vote in those races, or will you not go to the polls, or what?
Yeah.
My question, what impact might that have on other races down ticket?
Yeah, exactly. So actually, we do not provide that as a response category. Respondents actually volunteer that response category. And then once again, when we also looked at excluding those who volunteered they would not vote for the Senate race, we still found that Feinstein's lead over Kevin de León increased slightly.
Thank you for presenting, and I apologize if I missed earlier in the presentation. For the qualifiers on likely voters, were they self-proclaimed independents, or are they registered independents, since there's some confusion with like the American Independent Party and no party preference?
Yeah, so we actually are we conduct interviews with all adults, of all Californians above 18 years old, and then we identify likely voters using a set criteria. We use a likely voter screen, and that includes things such as intention to vote, voter intention in election, amongst other things. The full list of criteria is listed on the methodology of a report as well as online. Great. Any more questions? Great. Well, thank you all for being here today. Have a good weekend.